Civilizations we consider worlds apart were secretly in conversation. Long before written words, profound ideas about the stars, the soul, and survival crossed oceans and deserts, whispering between continents. This is the hidden reality of our deep past, a silent dialogue that shaped the very foundations of who we are. Today we explore the intercontinental knowledge transfers that preceded written history. By the end, you will possess a completely new lens through which to see human history, one that reveals a connected world where isolation was a myth. How did a story about a great flood echo from the Middle East to the mountains of the Americas? Why do monuments from Egypt to Cambodia align with the same star? We will delve into enigmatic evidence from shared mythologies to parallel pyramids, questioning everything we think we know about ancient isolation. What does it mean for our own story if our deepest wisdom was always a shared inheritance? The evidence for this silent conversation lies not in dusty archives but in the echoes of stories told around fires for thousands of years. To hear them, we must learn to listen in a different way. In a world before writing, knowledge was not a static thing you could look up. It was a living, breathing entity. It flowed on the rhythm of a chant, took shape in the hands of a potter, and was etched into memory by the repetitive motions of a ritual. This was the primordial network, a vast, intangible web of human connection built on memory, demonstration, and shared experience. Imagine the most important lessons of your culture. How to navigate by the stars, which plants heal and which harm, the proper way to honor your ancestors. Now imagine you have to pass every single one of these lessons to your children without writing down a single word. You would weave them into unforgettable stories. You would encode them in symbols painted on sacred objects. You would embed them in the steps of a dance or the design of a tool. This is precisely what our ancestors did for millennia. Their epic poems were not just entertainment, they were survival manuals and historical records. A single song could contain generations of agricultural wisdom, hidden in metaphors about gods and seasons. This method of transmission is why we find such startling parallels across continents. A core idea, like the concept of a world tree connecting the heavens, the earth, and the underworld, could travel. As it passed from one culture to the next, the names of the gods would change. The specific animals in the story would shift to local species, but the profound architectural idea of a central axis of the universe remained intact. It is like that childhood game of telephone, played across countless generations and over vast geographic distances. The precise wording gets blurred, but a powerful, resonant message can survive the journey, revealing a shared point of origin. So when we look at a symbol on an artifact from ancient Mesopotamia and see a hauntingly similar motif on a temple wall in Mesoamerica, we are not necessarily looking at direct copying. We are likely seeing the distant, evolved descendants of the same seed idea, carried along these ancient routes of exchange by storytellers, traders, and travelers. This foundational shift in perspective from searching for identical blueprints to recognizing transformed but familiar patterns is what allows us to move from mere speculation into the realm of identifiable historical connection. The library of early humanity was all around them, in the songs they sang and the symbols they carved, and its books were written in the universal language of human experience. The sky was the first map, the first clock, and the first sacred text. Across the globe, our ancestors looked up and saw not random points of light, but a grand, predictable order. They built their greatest monuments in conversation with that order. The Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt is precisely aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy that still astonishes engineers. Over 5,000 miles away, the great earthen mounds of Cahokia in North America, like the structure known as Monk's Mound, are also oriented to these same cardinal points. In Cambodia, the temples of Angkor Wat are designed to capture the sunrise on the spring equinox over its central tower. In the British Isles, Stonehenge marks the summer solstice sunrise with its famous heel stone. This pattern is not a coincidence. It is a chorus of cultures singing the same celestial song. How could societies with no known contact develop such precise and often identical astronomical knowledge? The answer may lie not in isolated genius, but in the transfer of a primordial star lore. This was not advanced astrophysics, but a set of vital, practical observations. Knowing when the sun would reach its lowest point in the sky, the winter solstice, told you the darkest days were ending and light was returning. Tracking the star Sirius's heliacal rising, its first appearance just before dawn, signaled the coming of the Nile flood in Egypt, an event essential for agriculture. This knowledge was a matter of survival, timing planting, harvesting, and migration. It was also deeply spiritual, connecting human rituals to the cycles of the cosmos. Such invaluable information became a prime candidate for long-distance transmission. Early migrants carried it in their minds as they populated new continents. Traders exchanged not just goods, but the stories and techniques that allowed them to navigate by the stars. A master builder from one region, sharing techniques with another, might explain that a temple's doorway must face the rising sun on a particular day to honor the gods. The specific deity's name might change, but the alignment, the underlying cosmic blueprint, remained. This explains why we see the same celestial fingerprints on monuments worlds apart. The orientation to the winter solstice sunrise, a symbol of rebirth, appears from ancient Ireland to the temples of Peru. The star Sirius, so crucial to one civilization, might be remembered in another culture's mythology as an important dog star or a beacon for spirits. These alignments are like finding the same unique keyhole on doors built by different architects. It strongly suggests they were all using a similar key, a shared understanding of the heavens that flowed along those ancient, invisible pathways of human connection. The stones themselves are silent, but their positions speak volumes about a world far more conversant than we ever imagined. But the celestial map was not the only shared text. If the stars provided the first calendar, then stories provided the first encyclopedia. Across every continent, the foundational myths of humanity read like chapters from a single, sprawling, and impossibly old book. A devastating flood sent by higher powers to cleanse the world, a cosmic tree or mountain linking all realms of existence, a hero who descends into darkness to retrieve a great boon for their people. These are not random imaginings, they are recurring motifs so specific and so widespread that their echoes form a second, powerful parallel, a symbolic language spoken by cultures that supposedly never met. Take the flood narrative. In the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, the god E warns the hero Utnapishtim to build a great boat to survive a world-ending deluge. In the Hebrew Bible, Noah receives a similar divine warning. In the Popol Vuh of the Maya, the gods send a great flood to destroy an imperfect wooden race of people. In Aboriginal Australian traditions, the Dreamtime tells of a vast flood that shaped the land itself. The details of the boat, the animals, the specific gods, all these are local adaptations. But the core framework, a catastrophic, purifying global flood, is a constant. This is not a story that independently sprang up in dozens of isolated minds. It behaves like a memory, a traumatic shared experience of rising waters at the end of the last ice age, perhaps, that was carried by human migration to every corner of the globe, and then woven into each culture's sacred history. Then there is the Axis Mundi, the world tree, In Norse mythology, it is Yggdrasil, an immense ash tree whose roots and branches hold the 9 worlds. For the Maya, it was the Waka-chan, the raised-up sky, often depicted as a great ceiba tree. Siberian shamans describe climbing a tree or a mountain to travel between the spirit world and our own. This is not just a pretty symbol, it is a sophisticated cosmological model, a 3-part map of reality, the heavens, the earth, the underworld connected by a central axis. The fact that this exact same model, this specific mental architecture for the universe, appears from the frozen north to the equatorial jungles suggests the transfer of a profound philosophical concept. It is as if different cultures were all given the same blueprint for a house and then decorated the rooms in their own unique styles. These myths were the hard drives of the ancient world. In an age without writing, you cannot store a complex idea about morality or geology or cosmology on a clay tablet, but you can encode it into a gripping story about a hero battling a dragon, a story so memorable it survives hundreds of retellings. The dragon itself, a near-universal symbol of chaos, might represent the unpredictable forces of nature or the inner demons of greed and pride. The hero's journey to slay it becomes a lesson in courage, sacrifice, and restoring balance. The tale of divine twins, found everywhere from Rome to the Americas, often explores the duality of human nature, light and dark, order and chaos. By analyzing these stories not as fairy tales but as vessels, we start to hear the whispers. A myth about a flood carries data about climatic change. A legend of a world tree transmits a whole philosophy of cosmic connection. The hero's journey encodes a psychological roadmap for personal and communal resilience. When the same vessel appears on opposite sides of an ocean, it is powerful evidence that the message inside once traveled the same invisible roads as the traders of obsidian and the navigators of the stars. Our oldest stories are therefore more than just folklore. They are the fossilized footprints of ideas that walked across the world. The stories and stars form a compelling pattern, but the most undeniable evidence is rooted in the earth itself. A silent witness to these ancient journeys is the humble bottle gourd. This plant, with its hard, buoyant shell perfect for making containers, is native to Africa. Yet its remains are found in archaeological sites across the Americas, dating back over 10,000 years. For a long time, scientists theorized the seeds could have floated across the Atlantic, surviving the voyage. But recent genetic research tells a different story. The ancient American gourds are not the wild African variety. They are the domesticated crop. This is a crucial distinction. A wild seed might travel by chance, but a domesticated plant is a human creation. It is a product of selective breeding, of generations of careful tending to encourage desirable traits like a thinner rind or a more useful shape. The presence of the domesticated bottle gourd in the Americas is not evidence of a floating seed. It is evidence of a carried idea. Someone, at some point in deep time, brought the knowledge of this plant and its cultivation across the ocean. It was a living piece of technology, a transfer of practical wisdom as valuable as any tool. An even more striking case is the sweet potato. This nutritious tuber is definitively native to South America. Its wild ancestors grow nowhere else. Yet when European explorers first reached remote Polynesian islands like Hawaii and Easter Island, they found fields of sweet potatoes already under cultivation. The local name for the plant, cumara, bears a stunning resemblance to its name in some Quechuan languages of the Andes, Cayuma. This is not a coincidence of nature. Sweet potatoes cannot survive a long saltwater journey by drifting. They rot. Their presence across the vast Pacific, paired with that linguistic clue, points to one astonishing conclusion. Polynesian voyagers, the greatest open ocean navigators in human history, reached the shores of South America. They met the people there, and in that encounter, an exchange took place. The South Americans gave them sweet potato cuttings, and the Polynesians, in turn, may have left something behind before sailing home with their precious new crop. This was not a migration but a deliberate voyage of exploration and connection. The plants themselves became a biological memory of the event. Think of what this means. It is not just a trinket or a symbol that was exchanged, but a source of life. The sweet potato transformed Polynesian agriculture, providing a reliable, storable food source that supported growing populations on remote islands. This is the most concrete form of knowledge transfer imaginable. It proves that these ancient interactions were not fleeting or superficial. They involved sharing the very foundations of survival. The movement of these cultigons, these purposefully cultivated plants, rewrites the map of prehistory. It draws a line directly from the Andes to Polynesia and suggests another, even more ancient line from Africa to the Americas. These botanical trails are like footprints fossilized in the genetic code of our food. They are undeniable proof that the oceans were highways, not barriers, and that a profound, intercontinental conversation about how to live and thrive was ongoing for millennia. This exchange of life-sustaining plants challenges the old paradigm of complete isolation at its core. It reveals a prehistoric world where a network of practical innovation was quietly flourishing, connecting hemispheres long before the history books say it was possible. But to accept that these ideas and plants crossed oceans, we must confront the most practical question of all: how the vast, empty blue spaces on our maps were not voids to our ancestors. They were the ultimate challenge, a puzzle to be solved with ingenuity and courage. Mainstream history has often painted ancient peoples as coastal huggers, too primitive to venture beyond the sight of land. Yet the evidence, when we truly look, tells a story of astonishing maritime ambition. To understand the transfer of knowledge, we must first appreciate the vessels that carried it. Consider the reed boat. In ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerians built majestic vessels from bundled reeds, capable of sailing the Persian Gulf and beyond. Thousands of miles away, on the high-altitude Lake Titicaca in South America, the Yoruba people have been building and sailing near identical reed boats called balsas for untold generations. The design is strikingly similar, a curved, canoe-like shape created from tightly bound totora reeds. This is not a case of independent invention converging on the only logical form. It is a specific, complex solution to a problem of buoyancy and construction. The similarities in technique, from the way the reeds are bundled to the method of securing them, are too precise to dismiss. They whisper of a shared maritime heritage, a very old idea about how to conquer water that may have traveled with early migrants across the world. Then there are the Polynesian voyaging canoes, the apex predators of ancient seafaring. These were not simple dugouts. They were sophisticated, double-hulled or outrigger vessels, some over 100 feet long, capable of carrying families, livestock, and provisions for voyages lasting months. Their sails, woven from pandanus leaves, could harness the wind across thousands of miles of open ocean. But the canoe was only half the technology. The other half was the navigator. These wayfinders, trained from childhood, used a system of deep knowledge we are only beginning to fully grasp. They read the stars not as static points, but as a moving compass rising and setting on specific horizons. They watched the patterns of ocean swells, feeling the subtle way the boat moved as different wave systems reflected off distant, unseen islands. They observed the flight paths of birds and the types of driftwood floating in the water. They navigated by memory, by song, and by a profound, embodied connection to the environment. With this technology, the Polynesians systematically discovered and settled virtually every habitable island across the Pacific, an area larger than all the continents combined. Their voyages were not accidental drifts. They were deliberate acts of exploration and colonization. If they could find a tiny speck like Easter Island in the vast eastern Pacific, is it so difficult to believe they might have ventured further, reaching the coast of South America? The currents and winds of the Pacific, like the Kuroshio and the North Equatorial Currents, form natural conveyor belts that could facilitate such a journey. Similarly, in the Atlantic, the Canary Current and the North Equatorial Current create a circular route, a marine roundabout that could have carried vessels from the coast of Africa to the Caribbean and back again. We are not talking about a single, miraculous voyage against all odds. We are talking about the cumulative effect of millennia of maritime experimentation. Each generation of boat builders refined the designs. Each generation of navigators added to the oral charts. What begins as a coastal fishing raft evolves over centuries into an ocean-going vessel. The journey that seems impossible to one generation becomes a remembered route for the next. This shift in perspective is crucial. We are not looking for a signed logbook from a transatlantic crossing in the year 3000 BC. We are establishing a reasonable probability. If reed boats of similar design appear on opposite sides of the globe, and if the greatest open ocean navigators in human history were actively exploring during the same era that American crops appear in Polynesia, then the oceans begin to look less like insurmountable barriers and more like the highways they truly were. The water was not a wall, it was a connective tissue, and the ancient mariners were its first messengers, carrying not just goods, but the very seeds of civilization from one shore to another. The most durable library of the ancient world was not made of paper or parchment, but of stone. From the windswept moors of Britain to the dense jungles of Central America, our ancestors left a cryptic message etched in granite and basalt. They moved mountains piece by piece to build monuments that have defied time itself. These are the megaliths, the great stones, and their silent presence poses one of archaeology's most persistent riddles. Were these colossal projects born independently in isolated cultures, or do they share a common intellectual ancestry? When you stand before the towering alignments at Karnak in France, thousands of standing stones arranged in eerie, parallel rows, the scale is overwhelming. It feels like a language written for giants. Then you look at the great dolmens, the stone table tombs found from Korea to Portugal, massive capstones balanced perfectly on uprights. You examine the polygonal walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, where stones weighing hundreds of tons are locked together in a jigsaw or so tight a blade cannot slip between them. The styles are distinct, shaped by local beliefs and materials, yet the underlying engineering challenges and the ingenious solutions to them echo with a strange familiarity. How do you quarry a 200-ton block without metal tools? How do you transport it miles across rugged terrain without the wheel? How do you lift it and place it with pinpoint accuracy? The answers developed by cultures supposedly separated by oceans and millennia are often startlingly similar. They used heat and water to fracture bedrock along natural lines. They employed log rollers, earthen ramps, and a profound understanding of leverage and counterbalance. This suggests something profound. It may not be that a single group of stonemasons traveled the world building everything. Instead, what may have traveled was a core set of principles, a foundational grammar of stone. This knowledge could have been carried by some of the earliest migratory waves of humanity, a toolkit of concepts about how to work with the Earth's bones. As these groups settled and their cultures diverged over thousands of years, they applied this shared grammar to their own unique architectural sentences. The spiritual impulse to build something permanent, to honor ancestors or align with cosmic forces, might be universal, but the specific technical know-how to execute it on a megalithic scale points to a shared source of innovation. Consider the mysterious stone spheres of Costa Rica, perfectly rounded monuments scattered in the jungle. Their purpose remains unknown, but their creation required a sophisticated, multi-stage process of shaping and polishing. This technique of pecking and grinding stone into precise forms mirrors methods used elsewhere. Or look to Easter Island, where the massive moai were not just carved, but transported miles from the quarry and erected upon great stone platforms. The oral traditions of the islanders speak of the statues walking to their places, a poetic memory that likely describes a clever rocking method of transport, a technique that also finds parallels in other parts of the world. These are not just similar goals, they are similar solutions. This pattern forms what we might call a lithic library. Each megalithic site is like a volume in this library, written in a local dialect but potentially referencing a much older, common text. The Cyclopean walls of Mycenae in Greece, the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela in Ethiopia, the great platform at Baalbek in Lebanon, they all speak of a deep, cross-cultural conversation about permanence, power, and the sacred. The stones do not tell us who the first teachers were, but their very existence argues against the idea of total prehistoric isolation. They stand as geological footprints, suggesting that the most fundamental ideas of engineering and sacred architecture were once fluid, crossing landscapes and seascapes on the journeys of early peoples. When we see a dolmen in India that looks like a dolmen in Ireland, we are likely not seeing direct contact between those two specific cultures. We are seeing the distant, evolved descendants of a very old idea, a seed of stone-working wisdom that was planted across the globe in deep time and grew into the world's most enduring mysteries. Scratched into stone, a language without letters speaks across the ages, from the sun-baked cliffs of the American Southwest to the wind-swept rocks of the Sahara, and onto the ancient shores of Siberia's Lake Baikal, the same silent symbols appear. A spiral swirls, concentric circles ripple outward. The stark outline of a human hand presses against the rock. These are not random doodles. They are a recurring visual chorus, a set of artistic echoes so persistent they demand an explanation. If the movement of plants proves the transfer of practical knowledge, and shared myths show the journey of stories, then these petroglyphs and pictographs hint at something even more fundamental: the transfer of a symbolic language for the human spirit itself. The symbols themselves are hauntingly simple, yet profoundly complex in their repetition. The spiral is one of the most universal. We see it at Newgrange in Ireland, carved into megalithic stones guarding a tomb aligned to the winter solstice. We see it in the American Southwest, etched by ancestral Puebloan artists. We see it in Australia, in the sacred art of Aboriginal peoples. It is a symbol with no obvious utilitarian purpose. You cannot hunt with a spiral. You cannot build a house with it. Its function was purely communicative and likely spiritual. Scholars suggest it could represent the journey of life and death, the cycles of the sun and moon, the path into an altered state of consciousness, or even the cosmos itself. Its power lies in its simplicity and its dynamic shape. It draws the eye inward, suggesting movement, journey, and transformation. Then there is the concentric circle, rings within rings. It appears in the cup and ring marks of prehistoric Europe, in the rock art of India, and across the Americas. It could symbolize a ripple in water, a celestial body, or layers of reality. Often, these circles are connected by meandering lines, creating labyrinthine patterns that look strikingly similar whether found in Scandinavia or in the Arizona desert. These are not maps of physical places, but perhaps maps of a spiritual journey, a path to a center, to enlightenment, or to a meeting with the other world. The most intimate symbol of all is the handprint, positive hands made by spraying pigment around a hand placed on the wall, and negative hands created by placing a paint-covered hand directly on the stone. They are signatures of presence, a way of saying I was here, but they are likely more than just graffiti. In many shamanic traditions, the hand is a conduit of power. A handprint on a cave wall might be a plea for hunting success, a mark of initiation, or an attempt to connect with the spirits believed to reside within the rock itself. The sheer geographic spread of this practice suggests it arose from a shared human impulse to make a sacred mark, to bridge the visible and invisible worlds through the most familiar part of ourselves. Perhaps the most compelling argument for a shared visual vocabulary comes from specific, complex figures. One is the so-called squatting man or shaman figure, a stylized human form with bent knees, often with raised arms and what appear to be horns or antennae on its head. Variations of this figure appear in the cave art of Europe, in the petroglyphs of Central Asia, and in the rock art of the American Great Basin. Its consistency is startling. Researchers like David Lewis Williams have proposed that such figures represent a universal human experience, the imagery born from altered states of consciousness, whether induced by rhythmic drumming, sensory deprivation, or ceremonial plants. The brain's neurology, when in such states, often generates similar visual phenomena, patterns of dots, grids, spirals, and the sensation of transforming into an animal or a spirit being. The horned man could be a direct depiction of this universal shamanic experience, a self-portrait of the practitioner in a trance state. This theory provides a powerful framework. It suggests that these petroglyphs are not a single, spreading religion, but rather a shared visual response to a shared human neurological experience. Early spiritual specialists, whether in the frozen tundra or the arid desert, were encountering similar visions in their quests for healing, knowledge, or connection. They then returned to their communities and translated those visions onto stone, using a symbolic code that, while locally adapted, contained recognizable core elements. This created a deep, pre-linguistic layer of understanding. A shaman from one group, encountering the rock art of another distant culture, might not understand their spoken language, but could potentially recognize the spiral as a symbol of a visionary journey, or the handprint as a mark of sacred power. In this way, the rock faces of the world became more than just local art galleries. They became nodes in a vast, silent network. They were the bulletin boards of the ancient world, broadcasting messages about cosmology, clan identity, and spiritual belief in a code that transcended spoken language. The artistic echo we hear is not proof of a single global cult, but evidence of a shared symbolic toolkit for describing the interior landscape of the human mind. It shows that the deepest transfer of all may have been the very way we learn to picture the unseen. This silent symbolic language was a profound form of connection, yet it was the mastery of a different kind of transformation that would truly reshape the ancient world. The discovery of metalworking stands as one of humanity's great technological leaps, a moment when fire and earth were combined to create something entirely new. The traditional story taught in textbooks is one of isolated genius. We are told that the smelting of copper from ore was independently invented in the Near East around 5500 B.C., in China around 3000 B.C., and in the Andes of South America around 1500 B.C. Each region, according to this view, stumbled upon the secret in glorious isolation. But when we look closely at the archaeological record, a more complex and interconnected picture emerges, one that challenges the simplicity of pure independent invention. The timelines, while separated by centuries, are not impossibly far apart when considering the slow, generational pace of ancient knowledge transfer. More telling are the technical similarities. The earliest metalworkers everywhere followed a remarkably similar sequence. It began with the cold hammering of native copper, the pure metal found in nugget form. Then came the crucial breakthrough, the smelting step, where copper was extracted from ore by heating it in a furnace with charcoal. Finally, the advanced stage of alloying, mixing copper with tin or arsenic to create bronze, a far stronger and more useful material. This progression is logical, yes, but the specific methods, the design of early furnaces, and even the types of artifacts first produced simple tools, ornaments, and ceremonial objects show parallels that are difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. This has fueled a long and passionate debate among archaeologists. On one side are the proponents of independent invention, who argue that the basic principle, that certain colorful rocks can yield metal when heated in the right conditions, could have been discovered multiple times by cultures experimenting with fire. They point to the vast distances and lack of clear evidence for contact between, say, Anatolia and prehistoric Peru. The other side, the diffusionists, look at the patterns and ask a compelling question. Is it more likely that this complex multi-step process was spontaneously reinvented multiple times, or that the core concept, once discovered, became the most valuable trade secret in the ancient world and slowly spread along the same invisible highways used for obsidian, shells, and stories? Consider the potential routes. In the Old World, the steppe corridors of Central Asia acted as a superhighway for thousands of years. Nomadic pastoralists moved vast distances, carrying goods and ideas between the settled civilizations of Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and eventually China. A metallurgical technique, perhaps originating in the Caucasus or Anatolia, could have traveled eastward in this way, adapted and refined by each culture it encountered. The evidence is in the artifacts themselves, which show a gradual eastward spread of bronze technology. But the most fascinating case lies across the ocean. The emergence of sophisticated copper and gold working in the Andes presents the ultimate test. Could the idea have crossed the Pacific? While no single piece of evidence is a smoking gun, the cumulative picture is suggestive. We know there was at least one point of contact proven by the sweet potato. If Polynesian voyagers reached South America, they would have encountered societies already working native metals. The concept of transforming stone like ore into a shiny, malleable substance would have seemed like magic, a technology worth remembering. It is not that Andean metalworkers were taught by foreign masters, but that the spark of the idea, the realization that such a transformation was possible, might have been ignited by such an encounter. This transforms metallurgy from a simple invention into a piece of intellectual property of unimaginable worth. The knowledge of how to find the right ores, build a furnace hot enough, and control the process to produce usable metal was power. It would have been closely guarded by guilds or families, passed down orally through initiation rites. Yet, like all valuable knowledge, it would also have been a commodity. A master smith might travel with a trading caravan, offering his services in exchange for rare materials or status. An apprentice might marry into a distant community, taking his skills with him. The technology would not spread as a complete blueprint, but as a seed, the fundamental principle that fire could birth metal from stone. Each culture would then nurture that seed with its own innovations, using local ores to create distinct artistic styles, from the intricate goldwork of the Moche to the ritual bronze vessels of Shang Dynasty China. So, were the great metalworking traditions of the world born separately or from a common source? The answer may lie in a middle path. The initial spark, the revolutionary concept, may indeed have diffused from a very early point of origin, carried along those ancient networks of human exchange. But the magnificent flourishing of the technology, the specific alloys, the cultural applications, that was the work of independent genius. This resolves the mystery not with a choice but with a synthesis. It suggests that our ancestors lived in a world where a groundbreaking idea could travel vast distances over generations, and where, upon arrival, it was not simply copied but reimagined, becoming something new and magnificent in the hands of those who received it. The metal itself thus becomes a metaphor for the entire process of ancient knowledge transfer, a base concept refined and strengthened through its journey across continents and cultures. The silent language of symbols and the transformative power of metal speak to a shared intellectual world, but perhaps the most vital knowledge of all was that which preserved life itself. In the quiet corners of every forest and across every plain, our ancestors conducted a grand, millennia-long experiment. They observed, they tasted, they tested, and they remembered which leaves could soothe a fever, which roots could mend a wound, and which barks could ease a troubled mind. This was the birth of medicine, an empirical science rooted in the earth. What is truly remarkable, however, is not that different cultures discovered healing plants, but that they often arrived at parallel conclusions for treating identical human ailments using completely different botanical sources. This pattern suggests something more profound than independent trial and error. It hints at the transfer of a foundational methodology, a way of seeing and interacting with the natural world to unlock its curative secrets. Consider a universal human complaint, the headache. In Eurasia, the willow tree provided relief. Its bark, when chewed or brewed into a tea, offered a measure of comfort. Centuries later, science would identify the active compound as salicin, a natural precursor to aspirin. Now, travel across the world to the Andes Mountains. Here, indigenous healers treated headaches and other pains with a local shrub, not a willow. Yet, when analyzed, this plant was found to contain compounds that function in a strikingly similar biochemical way. These two cultures, separated by an ocean and working with unrelated flora, had both identified plants that targeted the same physiological pathways. This is not a one-off coincidence. For digestive troubles, cultures from the Mediterranean to Mesoamerica cultivated bitter herbs to stimulate appetite and soothe the stomach. For wounds and infections, astringent plants high in tannins were commonly applied to promote healing on every inhabited continent. This points to a shared empirical framework. It was a process of deep observation and logical deduction. If a plant had a bitter taste, perhaps it could clear a bitter feeling in the body. If a leaf had a cooling sensation, maybe it could cool a fever. This was the beginnings of a systematic approach to healing, a proto-scientific method based on pattern recognition that could be taught and transferred. The knowledge of which specific plant to use in a given region was local, but the underlying principle of seeking out plants with certain sensory properties, bitter, astringent, warming, cooling, to address specific symptoms appears to have been a portable, universal concept. Even more compelling are the instances where the very same plant, or a closely related genus, appears in the pharmacopoeias of cultures worlds apart. The use of various species of the Artemisia genus, like wormwood or mugwort, presents a fascinating case. In traditional European herbalism, these plants were used to treat digestive parasites and fevers. In traditional Chinese medicine, the related Artemisia annua, known as King Hao, was historically used for fevers and chills. Modern research later confirmed it contains artemisinin, a powerful compound effective against malaria. This parallel use across vast distances for similar symptom complexes is deeply suggestive. Could the knowledge of this plant's specific febrifuge or fever-reducing properties have traveled along ancient trade routes? Or does it reflect an even older, shared botanical wisdom carried by the earliest migrations out of Africa, who knew the virtues of certain resilient, weedy plants that followed human habitation across the globe? The transfer of this healing lore would have been the ultimate act of practical compassion and strategic exchange. Imagine a scenario where two groups made contact, perhaps after a long sea voyage or at a distant trading outpost. Beyond the exchange of shells or tools, the most valuable gift one could offer might be the knowledge of a plant that could cure a debilitating illness common in the other's homeland. This was knowledge that meant the difference between a thriving community and one decimated by disease. It was immediate, applicable, and life-saving. Such exchanges would have elevated healers and shamans to the status of vital diplomats. Their minds were living libraries of botanical data, and their techniques, from preparing poultices to conducting rituals that addressed the spiritual dimensions of illness, formed a complete system of care. This system often viewed healing as a holistic endeavor, intertwining the physical with the spiritual. The concept that illness could stem from an imbalance within a person, or between a person and their community or environment, is another recurring theme across ancient medical traditions. The healer's role was not just to administer a remedy, but to restore harmony. This complex, integrated understanding of health suggests that what may have traveled was not merely a list of plants, but a philosophical framework for well-being. A healer from one tradition encountering another might not recognize the specific herbs used, but would likely understand the underlying principles of diagnosis, the use of ritual to comfort the patient, and the goal of restoring balance. In this light, the global echoes in ancient medicine are not simply about chemicals in plants. They are the enduring fingerprints of a once-shared human endeavor to understand suffering, to seek order in nature's chaos, and to pass on the hard-won wisdom that could keep the fragile flame of life burning. This knowledge was so essential, so woven into the fabric of survival, that its patterns across the map form one of the strongest arguments for a deep, enduring, and profoundly human connection long before the first history book was ever penned. Words themselves may be the ultimate time capsules, holding echoes of a world before borders. While the clear, direct links between the languages of the Americas and those of Eurasia remain unproven and fiercely debated, a more subtle hunt continues in the shadows of history. This search is not for shared sentences, but for shared sounds that might point to a common ancestral source, a time when the very first words for the most fundamental things in life were being formed. This is the realm of linguistic paleontology, a highly speculative but deeply compelling field that listens for the ghosts of a potential global mother tongue. Researchers in this area look beyond modern languages to their reconstructed ancestors, known as proto-languages. These are not languages anyone ever spoke, but rather scholarly best guesses, models built by comparing related languages and working backwards to deduce what their common parent might have sounded like. The question is, could we go back even further? Could we compare the proto-languages of different families and find traces of an even more ancient connection? For instance, linguists have noted that the word for mother across many unrelated language families often features an M or N sound. Mutter in German, M-A Macron letter 1 E6 D letter 1 E5, B in Sanskrit, mama in Mandarin, and similar forms in languages from the Americas to Africa. This is often explained by the natural, babble-like sounds infants make, which are then adopted by parents. But what about other core concepts? Some scholars have proposed the existence of global macro-families, vast linguistic supergroups that would link, for example, the languages of Eurasia with those of the Americas through a shared ancestor tens of thousands of years old. One of the most discussed is the Nostratic hypothesis, which suggests a family connecting Indo-European, Uralic, Altaic, and sometimes other groups. Proponents point to potential shared root words for elemental ideas. A hypothetical root like aqua, meaning water, has been proposed to connect words across these families. The search extends to other foundational terms for body parts, celestial objects, or basic actions. The evidence is not in full sentences or grammar, but in these fleeting phonetic resemblances for the bedrock concepts of human experience. It is crucial to understand that this is the frontier of linguistics, not its consensus. The methodological challenges are immense. Sound shifts over millennia are complex and can create false matches by pure chance. The further back in time you go, the fuzzier and more speculative the reconstructions become. Most mainstream linguists remain skeptical of these macro-family proposals due to the lack of rigorous, agreed-upon proof. Yet, the persistence of the search is itself a powerful story. It speaks to a profound human intuition that if our myths, our monuments, and our medicines show such deep parallels, perhaps our very first words might too. This is not about proving a single, unified global language. It is about exploring the possibility that the earliest human groups, as they migrated out of Africa and across the continents, carried with them a shared toolkit of sounds and meanings. As these groups separated over generations, their languages would have diverged dramatically, like a river splitting into countless streams, until the original connections became almost invisible. But perhaps in the words for water, sky, hand, or fire, we hear the faintest whisper of that original stream. The value of this search, even with its uncertainties, is that it forces us to listen to language not just as a tool for separation, but as a potential artifact of our deepest unity. It suggests that the most ancient knowledge transfer of all might be encoded in the very sounds we use to describe the world, a shared inheritance spoken on the breath of our earliest ancestors, echoing still in the way we name the things that matter most. Our very bodies hold the map of this ancient conversation. While stories, symbols, and tools traveled, they did not move themselves. They were carried in the minds and hands of people across generations and continents. Today, we can read that journey not in stone, but in our own genetic code. Through the study of mitochondrial DNA passed from mother to child and the Y chromosome passed from father to son, scientists have begun to chart the epic migrations that populated our planet. This is not just a story of movement, it is the story of knowledge itself on the move. Every single migration, every branching path our ancestors took was a profound transfer event. They did not travel empty. They carried with them an entire cultural package, the language they spoke, the way they chipped stone to make a spear point, the social rules that held their community together, and the sacred stories that explained their place in the cosmos. Their journey was a living library walking into new lands. Consider one of the greatest of these movements, the peopling of the Americas. For a long time, the dominant theory was a single, swift migration across the Bering Land Bridge near the end of the last ice age. But genetics now paints a richer, more complex picture. It suggests multiple waves of people moving at different times, some perhaps even traveling by boat along the Pacific coast. Each of these groups carried distinct genetic markers known as haplogroups, but they also carried distinct cultural toolkits. The knowledge of how to hunt massive mammoths, the technology to craft intricate micro blades for precise cutting, the spiritual beliefs surrounding the animals they relied upon, all of this arrived with them. As these groups spread southward, adapting to environments from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest, their original knowledge base adapted and mixed. They learned new things from the land and from each other, creating the incredible diversity of cultures that later Europeans would encounter. The genes tell us who was moving and roughly when. The archaeological record, the sudden appearance of a new type of spear point or a new artistic style, shows us what they brought with them. Together, they reveal that the settlement of two continents was not a blank slate, but a slow-motion dissemination of deep, accumulated wisdom. An even more precise example is the Austronesian expansion. Starting from Taiwan around 5,000 years ago, these incredible seafaring peoples embarked on a deliberate voyage of discovery and colonization that would eventually settle islands from Madagascar in the west to Rapa Nui, Easter Island, in the east. Genetic studies of modern populations trace this expansion clearly, showing a trail of related lineages across the vast Pacific. And what did they carry on their voyaging canoes? Everything. They brought domesticated plants like taro, breadfruit, and coconuts. They brought animals like chickens and pigs. They brought a distinctive style of pottery known as lapita ware. They brought their languages, which evolved into the hundreds of Austronesian languages spoken today. Most importantly, they carried the non-physical knowledge, the celestial navigation skills to cross thousands of miles of open ocean, the social structures needed to survive on a small island, and the myths that connected them to their homeland across the sea. This was not a haphazard drift. It was a purposeful, knowledge-driven colonization. each new island reached was an application of a vast, shared intellectual heritage. This genetic and cultural mapping allows us to reframe history itself. We can stop seeing the world as a collection of isolated bubbles where cultures invented everything in a vacuum. Instead, we can see it as a series of interconnected streams. A haplogroup is more than a biological marker. It is a signature of a journey. Where that genetic signature appears, we can reasonably look for echoes of the knowledge that traveled with it. The technique of pottery making might diffuse along the same route as a particular maternal lineage. A myth about origin from across the water might persist in a population whose genetics point to an ancient oceanic journey. The people were the vector, and their ideas were the cargo. This perspective makes the parallels we see across oceans feel less like miraculous coincidence and more like the expected outcome of a deeply connected human story. Our ancestors were not just moving to find food or escape changing climates. They were, whether they knew it or not, participating in the greatest project of all, weaving a planet-wide web of human understanding, thread by thread, generation by generation, one courageous journey at a time. The ground beneath our ancestors' feet was not a constant. It was a stage in motion, reshaped by forces far beyond human control. While migrations carried knowledge along deliberate paths, history also reveals moments when the map itself was violently redrawn, forcing a sudden and profound mingling of minds. These were the great climatic cataclysms, and they acted as a powerful, often brutal, catalyst for the diffusion of ideas. As the last great ice age waned, the world transformed at a pace that would have felt apocalyptic. Vast continental glaciers, miles thick, began their slow retreat, releasing unimaginable volumes of water into the oceans. Sea levels rose by hundreds of feet, not over millennia, but in sudden, terrifying surges. Coastlines that had been home for generations vanished beneath the waves. The great land bridges like Beringia that connected Asia and North America were swallowed by the rising Pacific, severing direct continental links. On land, ecosystems shifted, forests advanced, and grasslands appeared where ice once stood. For the human communities living through this, it was not a gradual change in background scenery. It was an existential crisis. Their entire way of life, built around hunting specific animals or harvesting coastal resources, was dismantled before their eyes. This forced a choice: stay and adapt with impossible speed, or move, and so they moved. These were not the planned, exploratory migrations of the Austronesian voyagers. These were urgent, desperate journeys of displacement. Populations that had been separated for thousands of years were suddenly set into motion, colliding with one another in new territories as they all sought refuge, water, and stable ground. These collisions, born of shared catastrophe, became incredible crucibles for knowledge exchange. Imagine the scene along a fertile river valley, suddenly receiving an influx of people from the drying plains and another group from the drowning coasts. Tensions would be high, resources strained, but necessity is the ultimate diplomat. To survive, they would have to talk, to trade, to share. The coastal people might bring sophisticated knowledge of fishing, boat building, and navigating by wave patterns. The inland hunters might share advanced techniques for tracking game in the new woodlands or working different types of stone. In this pressured, intimate contact, languages would borrow words, technologies would hybridize, and most importantly, stories would merge. They would share their explanations for the chaos engulfing them. The most dramatic and debated of these periods is known as the Younger Dryas. Around 12,800 years ago, just as the world was warming, a sudden climatic reversal plunged many regions back into near glacial conditions for over 1,000 years. The cause is still studied, with theories ranging from changes in ocean currents to the possibility of a comet impact. Its effects, however, are clear in the geological record. It was an environmental shockwave, For human societies, especially the sophisticated hunter-gatherers in places like North America, it was devastating. The large game animals they relied upon, like mammoths and mastodons, disappeared. This period of intense, rapid cooling and ecological collapse would have triggered massive social upheaval and migration. Groups that had developed distinct cultural identities over millennia were thrown together, their survival depending on a rapid pooling of intellectual resources. It is from crucibles like this that some of our most universal myths may have been forged. The global flood stories we find everywhere are not mere fantasy. They are likely the cultural memory of those generations who watched the seas relentlessly claim their ancestral homes, a trauma so profound it was woven into the sacred history of every descendant community. The motif of a world covered in ice or darkness in myth could echo the sudden, bitter cold of the younger dryas. The changing skies remembered in story might reflect the atmospheric chaos following a major impact event. These were not quiet times of isolated cultural development. They were frenetic, chaotic periods when the very fabric of human society was stretched and rewoven, blending threads from across the geographical spectrum. When the climate stabilized, these newly formed hybrid groups moved out, carrying their synthesized knowledge with them. A tool designed from one continent might appear in another not because of a direct, peaceful trade route, but because the people who invented it were pushed across a landscape until they met and merged with people from a distant shore. The cataclysm acted as a great shuffling of the human deck, ensuring that the cards dealt for the next phase of history were a mixed hand. This perspective reframes these ancient disasters. They were not just endings, but also strange and violent beginnings. The pressure of a changing world did not merely force people to move, it forced them to learn from strangers, to adapt foreign ideas with desperate creativity, and to encode the memory of the event itself into a shared story that would outlast the floodwaters and the ice. The very crises that threatened to erase humanity became, paradoxically, some of the most powerful engines for the spread of its collective wisdom. Numbers may be the most universal language we possess. Long before written equations, our ancestors were speaking in quantities and shapes, building a silent mathematics into the very fabric of their world. From the notched bones of prehistoric tally sticks to the perfect circles of Stonehenges, a common numerical intuition seems to hum across continents and millennia. This is our fifth parallel, the mathematical mind. At its most fundamental level, the concept of quantity appears everywhere. The human hand gave us base 10 systems, counting on fingers. But other cultures, perhaps counting both fingers and toes, developed base 20 systems like that of the ancient Maya. The Sumerians and Babylonians gifted us base 60, the reason we still have 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour. These systems diverged in their expression, but they all sprang from the same cognitive leap, the abstraction of oneness, two-ness, three-ness from the objects being counted. This suggests a natural, hardwired human capacity for numeracy, born from the need to track lunar cycles, manage shared resources, or count members of a community. Yet when we move from simple counting to geometry, the patterns become more specific and more mysterious. The circle, the triangle, the right angle, these are not just shapes found in nature. They are ideals, pure forms that ancient builders repeatedly sought to manifest in stone and earth. Consider the right angle. Creating a perfect 90-degree corner freehand is not intuitive. Yet we find it in the corners of the Great Pyramid of Giza with staggering precision, and we find it in the precise rectangular layouts of ancient cities from the Indus Valley to Mesoamerica. How were they achieving this? The answer likely lies in a simple, portable piece of mathematical genius, the builder's rope. By tying knots at regular intervals in a long cord, early surveyors could create a perfect 3-4-5 triangle, a Pythagorean triple long before Pythagoras. Stretching the rope with 12 equal segments, they could form a triangle with sides of 3, 4, and 5 units. The angle between the 3 and 4 unit sides is a perfect right angle. This technique, or variations of it using circles and arcs, was a transferable toolkit. An artisan schooled in this rope geometry could travel, and their knowledge could build a pyramid, lay out a temple foundation, or plan a city grid anywhere. This was not advanced theoretical math, it was practical, embodied knowledge passed from master to apprentice. We see the fruits of this knowledge in recurring ratios. The so-called golden ratio, approximately 1.618 to 1, appears in the proportions of the Parthenon in Greece and has been identified in the dimensions of the Great Pyramid. But it also appears in the growth patterns of sunflowers and nautilus shells. This raises the central question. When we see a harmonic proportion in art or architecture from two different cultures, are we seeing a transferred aesthetic principle, or are both cultures independently tapping into a pattern that feels inherently balanced and pleasing to the human eye because it echoes patterns we subconsciously recognize from the natural world? The evidence suggests it might be both. The human brain may be predisposed to recognize certain ratios as beautiful or stable, but the technical methods for replicating those ratios in large-scale construction, the rope tricks and geometric shortcuts, that was precious applied knowledge. It would have been as valuable as metallurgy or celestial law to the groups who possessed it. Itinerant master builders, perhaps moving along trade routes to oversee sacred projects, could have been the vectors for this spatial intelligence. They carried not a blueprint for a specific temple, but the living algorithm for creating sacred space itself. This explains why monuments separated by oceans can feel mathematically related, even if their artistic styles are worlds apart. They are different answers derived from the same set of ancient geometrical questions. The silent language of numbers and shapes, therefore, forms a deep layer of our shared intellectual heritage. It hints that before we wrote poetry or laws, we were thinking in angles and quantities, using the immutable logic of geometry to reach for the eternal, building a common understanding of the world one perfect right angle at a time. But alongside the epic voyages and climatic upheavals, there existed a quieter, more constant rhythm of connection. Think of a drop of ink slowly diffusing through still water, its color spreading inch by imperceptible inch until the entire glass is tinted. This is the essence of Demic diffusion, the slow, generational movement of people, and with them their entire cultural world, across the landscapes of the ancient earth. It stands in stark contrast to the dramatic sea crossings or the sudden collisions triggered by disaster. This was the patient, everyday migration of families, clans, and tribes, a process so gradual it would have been invisible to those living through it. A community might shift its hunting grounds a few valleys over. A daughter might marry into a group from the next river system. Over centuries, these small, incremental steps, perhaps only a few miles per generation, could carry a people and all the knowledge they held across entire continents. This was not a journey with a destination in mind, but a continuous, gentle drift, like the continents themselves moving on a human scale. And within this drift, ideas traveled not as traded commodities, but as living heirlooms. Every family that packed its belongings and moved carried an invisible library. The specific way a mother shaped a clay pot taught to her daughter. The unique pattern a father wove into a basket, a design that held meaning only his lineage understood. The precise chant used to call the game during a hunt, or the method for preparing a certain route to make it safe to eat. This was knowledge embedded in muscle memory and oral tradition, moving at walking pace across the generations. We can see the fingerprint of this process most clearly in the archaeological record of material culture. Take something as seemingly simple as a style of pottery. In a region, archaeologists might find a distinctive way of forming a pot's rim, or a particular method of decorating its surface with chord impressions. Over time, they can map how this style appears at one site, then at another 50 miles away a few centuries later, then another 100 miles beyond that a few centuries after that. This is not evidence of a pottery salesman touring the countryside. It is the material trace of people moving, taking their way of doing things with them, and sometimes teaching their neighbors who then adapted it. The same pattern can be seen in burial practices. The shift from burying individuals in a flexed position to laying them out extended, or the adoption of placing grave goods like tools or ornaments alongside a person, often spreads in a slow, wave-like pattern across a map. These practices were deeply tied to beliefs about the afterlife and the soul, core pieces of a community's spiritual understanding. Their gradual spread signifies not conquest, but the subtle blending of populations and the acceptance of new ideas about the sacred, passed from one generation to the next through proximity and intermarriage. This model of Demic diffusion is particularly powerful for understanding the deep connections across the great landmass of Eurasia. For tens of thousands of years, this continent was not a collection of sealed kingdoms, but a vast, open network of grasslands, river valleys, and mountain passes. The steppe corridor, stretching from the Black Sea to the borders of China, acted as a superhighway for this slow cultural drift. Nomadic pastoralists moving with their herds were constant agents of this gentle exchange. They did not need to launch fleets or forge empires to transfer knowledge. As they moved seasonally, they interacted with settled communities at the edges of the grasslands. A metal ornament from the Caucasus might find its way onto a steppe nomad's belt, and centuries later, a similar design might appear further east, adapted into a local tradition. The concept of the wheeled cart, once invented, did not stay in one place. It rolled slowly east and west, its design evolving with each community that adopted it, pulled by the slow, persistent movement of the people who used it. This same patient process was likely the first thread of connection into the Americas. The initial populations that crossed into the continent brought with them a toolkit of Siberian technologies and beliefs. As their descendants fanned out southward over thousands of years, that knowledge base diverged and adapted to an astonishing array of new environments, from Arctic ice fields to Amazonian rainforests. Yet, beneath the incredible cultural diversity that later emerged, there remained subtle, ancient threads, shared linguistic roots, distant echoes in myth, or foundational concepts about social organization that hinted at their deep, common journey. Demic diffusion was the background hum of human history, the constant, low-level current of connection that wove the subtle web long before any emperor could draw a border or any scribe could record a treaty. It reminds us that the most profound transfers often happened not in the halls of power, but around the hearths of countless families, in the daily acts of teaching and learning that accompanied humanity's slow, determined walk across the face of the world. The most tangible maps of this ancient conversation are written not on parchment, but in the earth. Long before camels carried silk across Asia, humanity's first highways were already bustling with trade, moving materials that held both practical and profound value. Archaeologists can now trace these invisible networks by following the trail of specific objects, like detective work across millennia. A piece of obsidian, the volcanic glass that makes the sharpest stone tools, can be chemically fingerprinted to its source volcano. When that same obsidian is found hundreds of miles away, it draws a line on the map of human connection. This was not random wandering. It was organized exchange, and the goods moving along these routes tell a story far deeper than simple commerce. Consider the vibrant red ochre, a clay colored by iron oxide. It was mined in specific, sacred locations and transported over staggering distances. Why was this colored earth so valuable? It had no practical use for building shelters or hunting game. Its value was symbolic, spiritual, and artistic. Ochre was used in burial rituals, likely representing life, blood, or transformation. It was the pigment for the world's first paintings, adorning bodies and cave walls. The fact that communities would go to great lengths to acquire this specific material from a distant source tells us they were trading in meaning. A seashell from a warm ocean carved into a bead and found in a burial mound far inland speaks of more than just beauty. It was a piece of a distant world, a symbol of status, connection, or spiritual power worn by an individual to tell a story about their place in a wider network. Where these material goods flowed, ideas were constant passengers. A trader arriving at a settlement with a bundle of obsidian cores from a distant, fiery mountain was not just a merchant. He was a conduit. He would share stories of the journey, describe the people he met along the way, and demonstrate the latest techniques for knapping the glassy stone into superior blades. He might explain how his people used ochre in their ceremonies, planting a seed for a new ritual practice. The shell necklace he offered might come with a tale of the great waters it came from, expanding the listener's mental map of the world. These exchange networks became the circulatory system for early globalization, moving innovation, belief, and aesthetic taste as reliably as they moved commodities. We can see this system operating on a grand scale in two remarkable examples. In the vast Pacific, the Lapita culture, ancestors of the Polynesians, created a maritime interaction sphere over 3,000 years ago. Their distinctive pottery, etched with intricate geometric patterns, appears on islands scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. Where the pottery is found, so too are tools of obsidian from a single island source, transported across open water. This was not a political empire, but a cultural and trade network. Through it, they shared not just pots and stone, but agricultural practices, canoe designs, and almost certainly the oral traditions and navigation secrets that would enable their descendants to conquer the remotest corners of the Pacific. At nearly the same time, on the other side of the world, a different kind of network flourished in the heart of North America. The Hopewell interaction sphere, centered in the Ohio River Valley, connected cultures from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. What flowed along these routes was astonishing. Copper from the Great Lakes region was hammered into elaborate headdresses and breastplates. Mica from the Appalachians was cut into shimmering sheets depicting celestial beings. Obsidian from as far away as Yellowstone traveled eastward. All these materials, along with shells from the Gulf, converged at monumental earthwork complexes where they were fashioned into ritual objects and placed in burials. The Hopewell phenomenon was not a single culture, but a shared ceremonial and economic language. People maintained their local identities but participated in a continent-wide exchange of both sacred objects and the cosmological ideas they represented. These networks demonstrate that the Stone Age was anything but isolated. Globalization is not a modern invention, it is a very ancient human impulse. The desire for connection, for novel materials, and for shared meaning created channels that spanned continents and seas. Every piece of obsidian, every cache of ochre, every string of shell beads is an archaeological telegram, a silent witness to a transaction that involved far more than what was held in the hand. They prove that the most vital trade was always in the intangible, the stories and skills that hitched a ride on the back of a material desire, weaving the world together one exchange at a time. These ancient trade networks moved ideas as surely as they moved obsidian or shells. Yet some of the most profound knowledge may have traveled along a different kind of pathway, one that existed within the human mind itself. A powerful argument for the deep transfer of spiritual understanding lies in the astonishing universality of the shamanic experience. From the frozen tundra of Siberia to the rainforests of the Amazon, from the deserts of Australia to the plains of Africa, we find strikingly similar spiritual practices. These traditions are built around a central figure, a mediator who can journey between the world of the everyday and the world of the spirits. What is so compelling is not just the shared role, but the shared methods used to achieve this transition. Ritual drumming at a specific, steady rhythm, repetitive chanting, prolonged fasting, sensory deprivation, and the careful use of certain psychoactive plants. These are all tools found in cultures continents apart, all designed for one purpose: to induce a profound, altered state of consciousness. This is not a coincidence of isolated cultures. It points to a discovery made by humanity in its deepest past, a discovery about the mind's own frontiers. When individuals enter these carefully cultivated trance states, something remarkable happens. Despite vast differences in language and environment, their reported visions share a common vocabulary of the mind. Practitioners across the globe describe the sensation of transforming into an animal, feeling feathers sprout or claws extend. They speak of flight, of soaring over landscapes to see distant places or to retrieve lost knowledge. They recount detailed communication with spirit beings, ancestors, or animal guides, and they map out intricate, layered cosmologies, worlds with upper, middle, and lower realms connected by a central axis, often a tree or a mountain. These parallels are too specific and too widespread to be random. They suggest that the neurobiological experience of the trance state itself provides a common, non-linguistic platform for exploring reality. The human brain, under these specific conditions, seems to generate a similar set of visionary themes. This shared internal landscape became a foundational spiritual technology. This has profound implications for the transfer of knowledge. If the very experience of the sacred journey has universal landmarks, then the wisdom gained from those journeys could form a core of transferable understanding. A shaman in one region, through vision, might learn which local plant combination could ease a fever. The specific plant knowledge is local, but the framework, the concept of journeying into an altered state to acquire healing knowledge from spirit guides, that is a portable methodology. A practitioner from a distant culture would immediately recognize the process, even if the songs and symbols were different. This shared framework could have traveled with the earliest human migrations, a spiritual toolkit as essential as the knowledge of making fire. It means that when we see similar depictions of a horned figure or a human-animal hybrid in cave paintings from France and rock art from California, we may not be looking at a diffused image. We may be looking at two artists separated by millennia and geography, independently drawing the same visionary being they encountered in a deeply altered state of consciousness. Their art is a report from a shared inner frontier. The shamanic complex, therefore, acts as a bridge, not just between worlds but between cultures. It provided a pre-linguistic common ground, a way of knowing that was based on direct, personal experience of an alternate reality. The rituals to achieve it, the maps of the spirit world, and the role of the mediator could all be taught and adapted as people moved and mingled. This spiritual technology was perhaps one of the first and most resilient forms of deep knowledge to be carried across continents, because it was rooted in the universal hardware of the human body and mind. It offered answers to the great mysteries of life, death, and illness, and those answers, discovered in the silent language of vision, echoed with a familiar resonance wherever human curiosity turned inward toward the unseen. A mountain is more than a geological fact. It is a bridge, reaching from the solid earth into the realm of sky and storm. It has been universally seen as a dwelling place of the divine, a point of contact between worlds. This profound, almost instinctual reverence gave rise to our sixth parallel, a global architectural principle that sought to capture that sacred connection in stone. When natural mountains were absent, our ancestors built their own. The great ziggurats of Mesopotamia were not just temples, they were artificial mountains. Their stepped tiers, like giant staircases, were designed to lift priests and rituals closer to the heavens. In Egypt, the smooth-sided pyramids were solar monuments, colossal ramps of stone intended to launch the soul of the pharaoh directly to the stars. Thousands of miles and years away, the stepped pyramids of Mesoamerica served a strikingly similar purpose. At sites like Teotihuacan or Chichen Itza, the pyramid was a stage for ceremony, its summit a place where rulers and priests could commune with celestial forces, often aligning precisely with the sunrise on a sacred day. In Southeast Asia, the Temple Mountains of Angkor Wat in Cambodia are perhaps the most literal expression of this idea, their soaring towers explicitly representing the mythical Mount Meru, the axis of the Hindu and Buddhist cosmos. This is not a vague similarity of form. It is a specific, recurring architectural solution to a shared spiritual problem: how to create a permanent, powerful conduit between the human community and the divine order. If the impulse was universal, the technical execution raises deeper questions. Why the stepped form? Why the frequent, precise alignment to cardinal directions? This suggests something more than a convergent intuition. It points to a potentially diffused template, a symbolic language for constructing sacred space that may have traveled along those ancient knowledge routes. A master builder versed in the sacred geometry of the center, and the axis could apply that principle anywhere, using local materials to express a global idea. The pyramid, in its various forms, becomes a kind of spiritual technology, a machine for connection built from a shared blueprint of belief. But what of the opposite direction, the journey not up but in? If the mountain connects us to the heavens, the cave connects us to the womb of the earth, to the ancestral past, and to the underworld. From the breathtaking painted caves of Lascaux in France to the ritual chambers beneath the pyramids of Giza, from the sacred cenotes of the Maya to the cave monasteries of Cappadocia, these subterranean spaces have served as universal sanctuaries. They were natural temples offering shelter, secrecy, and a profound sense of entering another realm. The act of descending into a cave is inherently symbolic, a movement inward and downward, away from the sunlit world of the living and into a place of mystery, initiation, and communion with the powers of the deep earth. The use of caves as galleries for magnificent art, as burial chambers for honored individuals, or as sites for oracle and vision quests, appears again and again across separated cultures. This dual reverence for the high place and the deep place forms a complete cosmological picture. It maps the vertical axis of the human spiritual experience, with the community inhabiting the middle world, connected above to the celestial and below to the chthonic through architecture and landscape. So, is this parallel a case of independent spiritual genius or transferred symbolic code? The answer likely lies in the interplay of both. The raw, emotional response to a towering peak or a silent cavern is a human universal, born from our deep time experience within the landscape. But the translation of that awe into a specific, formalized architectural language, the stepped pyramid oriented to true north, the cave sanctified as a portal and adorned with specific symbols, that is the work of culture. And culture, as we have seen, is contagious. The idea that you could build your own sacred mountain, that you could encode celestial knowledge into its very alignment, that a cave could be a gateway rather than just a hole, these are concepts. And concepts, once crystallized, can travel. They could move with migrating groups who carried the memory of their holy mountains and sought to recreate them in new lands. They could transfer between master builders at trading hubs, discussing the principles of sacred geometry. The resulting monuments, from the plains of Mesopotamia to the jungles of Cambodia, stand as majestic, stone-bound questions. They ask us to consider whether these great works are merely similar answers to a universal human question, or if they are distant relatives, speaking in different dialects but descended from the same ancient architectural thought. The stories of lost continents are more than fantasy. They are a haunting echo, a collective memory of something profound that slipped beneath the waves. From Plato's detailed account of Atlantis, a mighty island empire swallowed by the sea in a single day and night, to the Tamil legends of Kumari Kandam, a vast southern continent lost to the ocean, and the Greek tales of Hyperborea, a perfect, advanced land beyond the north wind, these narratives share a core truth. They speak of a golden age, a place of high knowledge and harmony, that was violently taken by geological catastrophe. While archaeologists have never found the sunken streets of Atlantis, the persistence of these stories across cultures points to a real historical experience, a trauma so deep it was woven into the mythic fabric of humanity. What if these are not maps to forgotten kingdoms, but to forgotten events? The end of the last ice age was not a gentle thaw. It was a period of immense geological upheaval. As the massive glaciers melted, sea levels rose by over 400 feet, drowning coastlines that had been home to human communities for thousands of generations. Entire landscapes vanished. What were once fertile river valleys and populated coastal plains became the continental shelves we know today. For the people living through this, it was an apocalypse in slow motion, punctuated by sudden, terrifying surges of water from collapsing ice dams. The memory of watching your world literally disappear, of being forced to become a refugee, would be indelible. It would be the defining story of your people. Over centuries, as survivors scattered and their descendants migrated, the specific details of the event would transform. The name of the lost land would change. Its description would become grander, its people more advanced, its fate more dramatic. But the core narrative, a flood of divine punishment or a great sinking, remained. This is how a shared environmental catastrophe becomes a myth. It becomes a vessel, a story that carries not just the memory of loss, but also fragments of what was lost. A community fleeing a drowned coastline would take with them their skills, their stories, their social structures. As they integrated with new populations inland, they would bring tales of their ancestral home across the water, a place of abundance and knowledge. To the listeners, this could easily sound like a description of an advanced civilization. The lost continent mythos, therefore, may be a form of cultural DNA. It is a narrative package that contains real information about diaspora, about seismic change, and about the preservation of identity under the most extreme duress. When we hear a story like that of Atlantis, with its detailed descriptions of concentric rings and advanced engineering, we should not ask if it was real in that form. We should ask what real, earlier civilization, perhaps a sophisticated coastal settlement now under the Mediterranean or the North Sea, inspired such a detailed and enduring legend. These myths are the echoes of the drowned lands themselves, and in their persistence, they testify to the most powerful knowledge transfer of all, the human will to remember, to make meaning from cataclysm, and to ensure that even a sunken world is not entirely forgotten. The line between a profound discovery and a compelling story is often perilously thin. This tension finds its perfect case study in the story of the Dogon people of Mali and the star Sirius. In the 1930s, French anthropologists reported something astonishing. The Dogon, whose astronomical traditions were passed down orally for generations, described Sirius not as a single star, but as part of a multiple star system. They spoke of a tiny, incredibly dense companion star they called Potolo, which they said orbited Sirius every 50 years. The staggering part, Sirius does indeed have a companion, a white dwarf star called Sirius B. It is completely invisible to the naked eye, and its existence was only confirmed by Western astronomers using powerful telescopes in the 19th century. Its orbital period is approximately 50 years. The alignment seemed too perfect to be chance. Here, it appeared, was unambiguous evidence of an impossible knowledge transfer, a precise astronomical fact preserved by an isolated African culture that could only have come from an advanced, perhaps even extraterrestrial, source in the deep past. The implications were revolutionary, and the story captured the public imagination, becoming a cornerstone of alternative ancient history. but science and rigorous anthropology require more than a compelling narrative. They demand context. As other researchers looked deeper, the miraculous story began to unravel. The first anthropologists to record the Dogon knowledge were not the first Westerners the Dogon had ever met. In the decades before their work, missionaries, colonial officials, and other travelers had been in the region. Crucially, a major public celebration of Sirius B occurred in the late 1920s, complete with popular magazine articles just before the anthropological studies began. The possibility of cultural contamination, of the Dogon incorporating this newly learned astronomical fact into their own oral traditions in a short period, became a strong and simpler explanation. Furthermore, a re-examination of the original ethnographic notes revealed potential ambiguities in translation and interpretation. The Dogon cosmological system is rich and complex, involving many stars and symbolic meanings. Isolating the specific claims about Sirius B from this broader context risked creating a distorted picture. This is not to diminish the Dogon or their sophisticated understanding of the cosmos, which is very real. It is instead a lesson in methodology. The Dogon controversy teaches us the critical importance of archaeological and historical context. An artifact, a story, or a piece of knowledge cannot be understood in a vacuum. We must ask who recorded it and when. What else was happening in the world at that time? What were the channels of potential contact? In the fervent desire to find evidence of glorious ancient transfers, it is easy to overlook the more recent, mundane pathways of information. This case also highlights the pitfalls of ethnographic reporting, where a researcher's own expectations can unconsciously shape how they interpret and present what they observe. The allure of the extraordinary can sometimes override the discipline of the ordinary explanation. So what does this mean for our broader exploration? It does not invalidate the possibility of ancient intercontinental knowledge transfers. Rather, it provides a crucial filter. It calls for a balanced, critical approach that weighs all evidence. Extraordinary claims, as the saying goes, require extraordinary evidence. The movement of the sweet potato across the Pacific is supported by genetic and linguistic data. The parallels in pyramid architecture are supported by archaeological surveys and dating. These build a cumulative case. The Dogon-Sirius story, while initially seductive, falters under the weight of contextual scrutiny when presented as proof of an ancient astronaut-style transfer. This distinction is vital. It ensures our search remains grounded, not in wishful thinking, but in a respectful, evidence-based inquiry that honors the true, documented ingenuity of ancient cultures without needing to attach supernatural or alien origins to their achievements. The real story of human connection is wondrous enough without the embellishment. For decades, the very idea of ancient transoceanic contact was treated with deep skepticism, even dismissal within mainstream academia. This was not an accident of scholarship, but a necessary and important reaction. The pendulum of historical thought had swung hard. Earlier theories of hyper-diffusionism, popular in the 19th and early 20th centuries, often carried a heavy, ugly baggage. These models frequently argued that all civilization flowed from a single, superior source, usually imagined as a lost white race or a specific old world cradle. Every pyramid, every megalith, every complex society outside of Europe was framed not as an indigenous achievement, but as the diluted echo of a master teacher. This narrative was a tool of colonialism, used to justify conquest by asserting that native peoples were incapable of their own genius, merely passive recipients of a superior culture's wisdom. In the face of this, a powerful corrective emerged. The new orthodoxy championed independent invention. It insisted, rightly, on honoring the innate creativity and intellectual power of every human society. It argued that similar environmental challenges, the need to track time, to build shelter, to explain the cosmos, could naturally lead to similar solutions in complete isolation. This paradigm celebrated cultural sovereignty. It gave us back the Mayan astronomer, the Andean engineer, the Polynesian navigator as brilliant, autonomous innovators. And in doing so, it performed a vital ethical service. But in our zeal to correct a racist past, a critical question now whispers from the evidence. Did we construct a new story that is, in its own way, just as improbable? The theory of pure independent invention asks us to accept a staggering number of coincidences. It asks us to believe that the precise concept of a stepped pyramid aligning with celestial events was dreamed up not once, not twice, but in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Mesoamerica, and Southeast Asia entirely in isolation. It asks us to accept that the sweet potato crossed the Pacific by itself, and that the bottled gourd floated from Africa to the Americas, and then conveniently taught humans how to domesticate it. It asks us to see a world map dotted with cultures who, against all statistical likelihood, kept rediscovering the same complex spiritual frameworks, the same architectural principles, and the same botanical solutions, all while having no contact whatsoever. This paints a picture of human history that is paradoxically less creative. It suggests our ancestors were like students in separate, soundproof rooms, all inexplicably writing the same intricate essay on the final exam. The evidence we have explored, the genetic trails, the linguistic whispers, the shared mythic cores, suggests a more dynamic, more interesting, and ultimately more human story. It points us toward a nuanced middle path, a model we might call selective diffusion. This is not a return to the old, simplistic hyper-diffusionism. It does not claim a single source for all civilization. Instead, it proposes that certain foundational ideas, certain seed technologies, and certain profound stories possessed a unique portability. They were packets of high-value information that could travel extraordinary distances along the slow, ancient networks of migration and trade. But here is the crucial, beautiful part. When these seed ideas landed in new soil, they did not simply replicate. They were not copied like a blueprint. They were transformed. They met local genius, local materials, and local spiritual needs. The seed of pyramid as sacred mountain could blossom into the smooth limestone majesty of Giza in one place, and into the steep, temple-crowned platforms of Tikal in another. The concept of altered state as gateway to knowledge could lead to Siberian drumming rituals in one culture and Amazonian plant ceremonies in another. This model celebrates both connection and unique innovation. It acknowledges that a revolutionary idea, once discovered, is humanity's most precious cargo, worthy of being carried across continents. But it also insists that the true marvel is in the adaptation, the brilliant local flowering that turns a shared seed into a distinct cultural masterpiece. It allows for the Polynesians to be the greatest navigators in history, while also accepting they might have acquired the sweet potato from South America. It allows the builders of Stonehenge and the architects of Angkor Wat to both be profound astronomical geniuses, while leaving open the possibility that they were working from chapters of a very old, shared celestial playbook. This is not a diminishment of anyone's achievement. It is an elevation of our shared human story. It replaces a narrative of isolated brilliance with one of collaborative, cumulative intellect across time and space. It suggests that the story of humanity is not one of many separate lights flickering on in the dark, but of a single, slowly spreading flame, passed from hand to hand, each keeper adding their own fuel and shaping its light in a unique and glorious way. A profound silence follows the final breath, a universal human mystery that every culture has sought to answer. The rituals surrounding this moment, the careful preparation of a resting place, form one of our most intimate and revealing parallels. From the sun-baked plains of ancient Russia to the river valleys of Australia and the forests of prehistoric North America, a startling practice emerges. Individuals were laid to rest adorned with a vibrant red powder, ochre, scattered over their remains or used to stain ceremonial objects. This was not a random act. The color red, the color of lifeblood, seems to have been a deliberate, symbolic choice, a hopeful gesture perhaps meant to restore vitality or ensure safe passage into whatever came next. Separated by tens of thousands of miles and years, these communities arrived at the same profound symbolic language for confronting loss. Equally striking is the deliberate shaping of the human body, even in death. The practice of cranial deformation, of gently binding an infant's head to create a distinct, elongated skull shape, appears in cultures as distant as the Maya of Central America, the Huns of Eurasia, and certain groups in ancient Peru and Vanuatu. This was not an accident of nature, but a cultural marker, a sign of status, beauty, or group identity that began at birth and followed an individual to their final resting place. The fact that this very specific, non-utilitarian practice emerged independently across the globe suggests a shared human fascination with transcending our natural form, of shaping the body itself into a vessel of cultural meaning. But perhaps the most powerful parallel is the near-universal belief reflected in the objects placed alongside the departed. From the simplest stone tool to the most ornate golden mask, grave goods tell a consistent story. Our ancestors across continents acted on a shared conviction that the journey did not end with the last heartbeat. They sent their loved ones into the next existence equipped. A pot might hold sustenance for the road. A weapon could offer protection in an unknown realm. A piece of jewelry might signify status among the ancestors. This practice is so pervasive it forces a fundamental question. Are these ideas purely instinctual, a spontaneous psychological reaction to grief and the fear of oblivion, or do they point to something older, a transferred spiritual framework? The answer may lie in the very first journeys our species ever took. When the earliest groups of Homo sapiens began their slow dispersal from Africa, they did not travel as blank slates. They carried with them a nascent culture, a toolkit of survival skills, social rules, and almost certainly, a developing web of beliefs about the world and their place within it. The trauma of death, the bewildering disappearance of a companion, would have been one of their first great existential puzzles. It is plausible that the earliest responses to this mystery, the first comforting stories of a continued existence, the first symbolic acts meant to honor the departed, were part of that original cultural package. These would have been the seed ideas. As populations branched out across the globe, isolated for millennia, these seeds grew into the incredible diversity of afterlife beliefs we see in historical records, from the elaborate Egyptian field of reeds to the Norse hall of Valhalla. The local expressions became wonderfully distinct, yet beneath the variation in gods and landscapes, the foundational architecture often feels familiar, a realm to be traveled to, a judgment or reconciliation, a reunion with ancestors, a need for provisions from the living world. This deep substrate, this shared intuition that consciousness or identity persists in some form, may be our oldest inherited knowledge. It is not a detailed map of the afterlife that was transferred, but the compass itself, the innate human orientation toward a horizon beyond physical death. The red ochre, the shaped skull, the placed offering, these are the very dialects of a single, ancient language spoken in the face of the unknown, suggesting that our first and most profound spiritual questions were asked and tentatively answered together, long before we built walls to separate our worlds. The silent stories of our past are now finding their voice in the language of science. For generations, the evidence for these ancient connections relied on the human eye, spotting similarities in artifacts or myth. Today, we are no longer just observers, we are decoders. A suite of revolutionary technologies is allowing us to read the hidden text of prehistory, transforming whispers into verifiable data. The most profound of these tools is archaeogenetics. By extracting and analyzing ancient DNA from human remains, scientists can now trace migrations with a precision once unimaginable. We are no longer guessing about the movement of people, we are mapping it. When we identify a specific genetic lineage in bones from a burial mound in Siberia, and then find that same lineage in ancient remains from the Pacific coast of the Americas centuries later, we have drawn a direct line on the map of human movement. And where people moved, their entire cultural universe moved with them. This genetic evidence provides the sturdy, biological framework upon which we can now hang the artifacts, the languages, and the myths, showing us not just that ideas could have traveled, but along which specific human highways they likely did. It turns speculative pathways into historical routes. Alongside this biological mapmaking, another powerful tool is scanning the library of human imagination. Computational analysis allows researchers to process thousands of myths, folktales, and linguistic structures from cultures around the world, searching for patterns invisible to a single scholar reading texts. A computer can analyze the complex relationships between story elements, like the sequence of events in a hero's journey or the specific attributes of a flood narrative across hundreds of traditions. It can perform statistical tests to determine if the similarities between, say, a creation myth from West Africa and one from South America are likely due to chance or to a deeper, shared origin. This moves the study of comparative mythology from an art of intuition to a science of probability. We are beginning to quantify the echoes, measuring the strength of the signal that suggests a common ancestral story was carried across the world and adapted over millennia. It is a way of listening to the global campfire and hearing which songs have the same very old tune. Our view from above has also been utterly transformed. Satellite imagery and LIDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, are acting like X-ray vision for the planet's surface. From orbit, satellites can identify subtle variations in vegetation that reveal the outlines of ancient roads, irrigation canals, and settlement patterns long buried under forest or sand. But LIDAR is even more astonishing. Mounted on aircraft, it fires millions of laser pulses at the ground, penetrating thick jungle canopy to create a detailed, three-dimensional map of the terrain below. This technology has unveiled entire lost cities in the jungles of Cambodia and Central America, revealing urban networks of staggering scale that rewrite our understanding of those civilizations. For our search, these tools are invaluable. They allow us to trace the physical infrastructure of connection, the roads that linked trading centers, the canals that moved goods, the paths that guided pilgrims. By mapping these networks, we can see how knowledge flowed along tangible corridors of exchange, from one valley to the next, from one river system to another, connecting cultures we once thought were separate. We can literally see the web being woven. This convergence of disciplines, genetics, data science, and remote sensing marks a turning point. It is moving the grand mystery of ancient knowledge transfer from the realm of fringe speculation into a rigorous, evidence-based field of study. The questions that have captivated us for centuries about shared stars and parallel pyramids are no longer just philosophical puzzles. They are now scientific hypotheses that can be tested. We are building a new history from the ground up, molecule by molecule, day to point by data point, laser pulse by laser pulse. This interdisciplinary approach does not diminish the romance of the past, it deepens it. It promises that the next chapter in this story will be written not with assumptions, but with answers, finally allowing us to hear the full, connected symphony of our human origins. These separate threads now weave into a single, stronger tapestry. The stars, the seeds, the stones, and the stories are not isolated curiosities. They are different notes in the same ancient symphony. To hear the full composition, we must step back and see the pattern they collectively reveal. The evidence points us toward a new model of the deep past, one that replaces the old map of isolated cultural islands with a dynamic, living web of human connection. This is not a return to simplistic tales of a single lost civilization seeding the world. That old hyper-diffusionist idea was not just incorrect, it was ethically fraught, diminishing the brilliant ingenuity of every unique culture. Our new understanding is far more nuanced and far more interesting. Imagine the ancient world not as a collection of silent, walled gardens, but as a vast, whispering forest. The trees are distinct, each growing in its own soil, reaching for the sun in its own way. But beneath the surface, their roots intertwine. Messages travel through the fungal networks in the soil, from one root system to another. Birds carry seeds from one canopy to a distant clearing. This is the model the evidence demands, a complex, multi-directional web of interactions that operated on every conceivable timescale. Some connections were like lightning strikes, rapid and direct. A Polynesian voyaging canoe makes landfall on an American shore. A trade caravan completes a treacherous journey across the steppes. In these moments, knowledge could transfer almost instantly, a complete package like the sweet potato cutting or a master smith's technique. Other transfers were glacially slow, the work of millennia. This is the patient process of Demic diffusion, where families and clans shifted their ranges a few miles each generation, carrying their entire way of life with them across continents, their languages and legends slowly blending with those they met along the way. The intensity of these exchanges varied, too. Sometimes it was the transfer of an entire, complex idea, like the architectural blueprint for a celestial pyramid or the complete ritual use of a psychoactive plant for visionary journeys. Other times it was merely a seed, a spark. The seed might be a fundamental concept like the world has 3 layers or the stars are a calendar. That seed would then land in the fertile ground of a new culture and blossom into something utterly unique. The Mesoamerican stepped pyramid and the Egyptian smooth-sided pyramid are both magnificent, but they are distinct cultural flowers grown from the same seed idea of a sacred mountain. This model resolves the old, tiresome debate between isolation and invasion. It shows us a middle path that is richer than either extreme. In this web, every culture is both a receiver and a transmitter, a student and a teacher. The ancient Andeans were brilliant engineers in their own right, yet they may have shared the sweet potato. The builders of Stonehenge possessed profound local genius, yet they worked with a celestial knowledge that echoes in other hemispheres. This does not diminish their achievements, it contextualizes them within the grand, collaborative project of being human. It presents a world where, for tens of thousands of years before the first written empires of Rome or Xi'an, humanity was already in constant, low-level conversation. Isolation was the rare exception, not the enduring rule. This fundamentally changes our perception of cultural development. We are not the products of lonely geniuses toiling in solitude. We are the heirs to a planet-wide intellectual commons, a shared reservoir of hard-won wisdom about the sky, the earth healing, building, and the spirit that was slowly, patiently compiled by our collective ancestors. Our deepest stories and most foundational technologies were likely never owned by one people, but were instead the common property of a species on the move, forever sharing, adapting, and remembering under a single, ancient sky. This interconnected past is not merely an academic curiosity. It carries a profound and immediate weight for who we are today. If the great monuments and myths that define our civilizations are threads in a much older, shared tapestry, then it forces us to reconsider some of our deepest assumptions about identity and heritage. For centuries, the story of history has often been one of distinct, isolated peoples, each cultivating their own pure cultural lineage in splendid isolation. We speak of ancient Egyptians, of classical Greeks, of the Maya, as if they were self-contained worlds, but the evidence whispers a different truth. These cultures were not closed loops. They were conversations, the very foundations of what we celebrate as their unique achievements. Their mathematics, their astronomy, their spiritual philosophies show the fingerprints of a much older, global exchange. This realization gently dismantles the idea of cultural purity. It challenges the notion that any one group can claim sole ownership over the fundamental ideas that make us human. The pyramid is not an Egyptian idea or a Mesoamerican idea in an exclusive sense. It is a human architectural solution to a universal spiritual question, refined in different laboratories across the world. Our heritage, therefore, is not a series of separate streams, but a single, braided river. We are all inheritors of a shared intellectual legacy, a common toolbox of understanding that was assembled collaboratively over tens of thousands of years by our curious, wandering ancestors. This perspective offers a powerful antidote to narratives of essential difference, the kind that fuel division and conflict by insisting on unbridgeable gaps between peoples. Instead, it reveals a deep substrate of commonality, the human impulse to measure the stars, to seek healing in plants, to build structures that touch the divine, and to tell stories that explain our place in the cosmos. These are not the inventions of any single culture. They are the collective project of humanity. Recognizing this fosters a sense of shared legacy. It means that when we look at the night sky mapped by the Babylonians or study the geometry encoded in a Cambodian temple, we are not looking at the property of a distant them. We are exploring chapters of our own extended human story. This reframes innovation itself. Our greatest leaps have never truly been about isolated genius. They have been about connection. A new idea emerges somewhere and then it travels. It is adapted, improved, and transformed by others far away. What we call progress is this endless cycle of sharing and building upon the work of those who came before, regardless of where they were born. This collaborative spirit is not a modern invention of the internet age. It is, in fact, our oldest tradition. It is the original open-source network, running on foot and sail for millennia. Recovering this knowledge from the silent past is perhaps the most valuable archaeology we can undertake. It does not diminish the glory of any civilization. On the contrary, it elevates the entire human experiment. It asks us to embrace a more humble, unified, and collaborative view of our history and our future. If our ancestors, with all their technological limitations, were constantly reaching across perceived barriers to share what they knew, what does that say about our own potential today? Their legacy is an invitation, a reminder that our strength has always lain not in our walls, but in our bridges woven from stories, stars, and seeds passed hand to hand across the ages. Our journey through the whispers of the ancient world reveals a landscape far more connected than our history books have long suggested. The evidence we have walked through, from celestial maps to botanical trails, does not point to a single lost source of all wisdom, but to a vibrant, multi-directional conversation. This was not a broadcast from a lone teacher, but a constant, low hum of exchange, a shared project of building understanding across the face of the earth. The intercontinental knowledge transfers that preceded written history were not the stuff of fantasy, but a plausible, even likely, engine of early human development. They represent the most natural outcome of a curious, mobile species. When we see the same star lore encoded in monuments an ocean apart, or the same flood narrative echoing across continents, we are not seeing proof of a global empire. We are seeing the fossilized ripples of ideas that traveled with people, carried in stories and songs, and adapted brilliantly to new homes. This process of selective diffusion, where a seed concept finds unique local expression, is far more powerful than any tale of a single super civilization. It shows human ingenuity at its most resilient and creative. From shared stars to shared stories, from traded plants to parallel pyramids, the evidence points to a deep history of interaction. This interconnectedness does not diminish the brilliance of individual cultures. In fact, it magnifies the human capacity for communication and synthesis. The Maya astronomer and the Egyptian architect were both profound geniuses in their own right. Our new understanding suggests they were also participants in a much older, slower conversation about the cosmos, using a shared symbolic language that had been passed down and transformed over millennia. Their achievements are not lessened by connection, they are contextualized within the grand collaborative project of our species. As we stand on the shoulders of these ancient giants, let us remember that their wisdom was likely a collective inheritance. The foundations of our mathematics, our medicine, our astronomy, and our deepest spiritual questions were likely never owned by one people. They were the common property of humanity, slowly compiled and refined through countless encounters over countless generations. This perspective invites a profound shift. It asks us to look at the monuments of the past not as trophies of isolated genius, but as chapters in a single, sprawling story we are all still writing. It suggests that our strength has never lain in isolation, but in our enduring, ancient impulse to reach out, to share, and to build upon what came before. If this exploration has reshaped your view of the past, we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What parallel or connection did you find most compelling? Subscribe for more journeys into history's greatest mysteries and keep questioning the stories we think we know. The past is not a closed book, it is an open conversation, and we have only just begun to listen.